Greetings, everyone. Good day, wherever you are in the world. I am Dr. Patricia Northover, Senior Fellow at the University of West Indies, Sir Arthur Lewis Institute for Social and Economic Studies. Welcome to this regional forum. I trust that you're all today in a good place. Special welcome to representatives from the Ministry of Investment, Industry, Commerce from Jamaica, the Ministry of Finance representatives from the Ministry of Finance from the British Virgin Islands, representatives from the Ministry of Health in Jamaica, representatives from the United Nations organizations such as the United Nations Development Program in Jamaica, United Nations Children's Fund, and from the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. Also want to reach out and give special greetings to our University Registrar, Dr. Maurice Smith, as well as all our university colleagues and fellows in the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute. And last but not least, representatives from the Fiji National University. I wish to acknowledge the apologies from Principal Weber and from Dean Tennant, who's the Dean for the Faculty of Social Sciences. Today, we will have 4 highly trained development economists speak to the topic for this regional SALISES forum, which is public financing for sustainable development in the time of COVID-19 or war era and beyond. We are undoubtedly living in an extraordinarily turbulent and dangerous time. In such a context, even well-endowed states like the United States of America are stretched to capacity in order to meet with the complex shocks and systemic stresses like climate change that prevail today. Our speakers today will focus on the small island developing states in the Caribbean and explore how these states could both recover economically and provide social protection for the most vulnerable in their societies. However, these states are grappling with both multidimensional vulnerabilities, for example, environmental, economic, social, and geopolitical, as well as high levels of indebtedness, with the average debt to GDP ratio in the CARICOM region being over 80%. These facts are deeply interconnected. According to a 2018 study by UNCTAD, for the entire Caribbean region, the average cost of damage as a percentage of GDP between 1980 and 2015 was about 2/3 of the rate of their combined economic growth in the region. In 2017 alone, the Atlantic hurricane season amounted to US dollars 215 billion. The COVID-19 pandemic and geopolitical instabilities have placed such Caribbean small states in a space of extraordinary vulnerability to which our nation states must appropriately respond. How do the current escalating prices in energy, in food, in fuel, create risk for public finance through channels of debt and economic vulnerability? How have these cumulative shocks impacted fiscal spaces? Our panel of experts will be exploring some of these challenges and questions. We will be assessing the constraints as well as the spaces for innovation in our fiscal policy for sustainable development. I will be introducing our panel today, and each person will have approximately 15 minutes to speak, after which after all presenters have spoken, we will then have about half an hour for questions. To ask a question, please post it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen or in the chat section, and we will do our best to address your concerns. In closing, we will have a vote of thanks given by Mr. Nelson Stokes. I now wish to introduce our esteemed panelists. We will begin with Dr. Clarence Henry, and then Dr. Kevin Williams, followed by Dr. Dillon Alleyne, and then Dr. Preeya Mohan. I will introduce them in the order in which they will present. So Dr. Clarence will be speaking to economic resilience amongst OECS SIDS in a time of uncertainty, overcoming the era of COVID-19 and war. Dr. Clarence Henry is a St. Lucian development economist. Dr. Henry previously held the post of lecturer in economics at the Sir Arthur Lewis Community College in St. Lucia, where he served for 8 years. He currently serves in the service of the Commission of the Organization for Eastern Caribbean States in the capacity of Senior Technical Officer, Regional Integration Specialist. Our next speaker would then be Dr. Kevin Williams, who is no stranger to us. He's a Senior Research Fellow at SALISES Mona. He will be followed by Dr. Dillon Alleyne, who is the Deputy Director for the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. Dr. Alleyne is no stranger to us as well, as he was also a lecturer at the University of the West Indies, and he continues to lecture at the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute. Dr. Preeya Mohan is also a senior fellow at the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute for Social and Economic Studies, and she has done multiple research activities on a wide range of topics focused on Caribbean growth and development, climate change, diversification, public finance, innovation, and entrepreneurship. Her topic will as well be on public financing for sustainable development in COVID-19, war era and beyond. And Dr. Alleyne will speak to an appropriate fiscal policy for post-COVID-19 Caribbean. If there are any changes in the topics, the presenters would alert you when they begin their PowerPoint presentation. So I'd now like to turn the floor over to Dr. Clarence Henry to begin his presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Northover. Good evening to all. Let's just put this in presentation mode. Yes. Okay, my topic this evening really focuses on the whole question of economic resilience among OECS small and developing states in the time of uncertainty, overcoming the era of COVID-19 and war. So in this presentation, I seek to give a brief overview, particularly focusing on understanding the OECS economies, looking at the stylized facts. Anyone who speaks of the OECS economies, be it from Antigua and Barbuda in the north to Grenada in the south, should appreciate what characteristics really define the OECS economies. And then I want to speak briefly on the whole issue of why is fiscal stability a challenge? Because we've always spoken about the need for governments to have fiscal responsibility to keep debt levels low. But why is it that this task of seeking for fiscal stability seems to be a problem, an ongoing problem for the last 2 decades or more? And the question then that I seek to address is the whole issue of where do we go from there? Because we cannot continue to perform the manner in which we are performing. We cannot continue to be knocked down seriously all the time when there is some sort of global shock. So in terms of the overview, and I think I'm missing a very key characteristic there, which I'll point to. So the OECS economy is a small microeconomies. We know that, right? In terms of population size, if you bring all of the economies in the OECS that form the Eastern Caribbean Economic Union under the revised Treaty of Bastia, you barely have over 600,000 persons in terms of a potential market size, with the smallest market being Montserrat, barely 5,000 persons, with the largest being St. Lucia with about 1,081, 82 persons. We're export dependent. You know, we've moved from an agrarian economy dependent on bananas and sugar in the 80s to now a service-driven economy dependent largely on tourism in many quarters. Limited human resources is continuously a challenge. High levels of unskilled labor continues to be a challenge. Limited inter-regional trade performance for the most part, within the context of the CARICOM single market economy, the OECS economies tend to contribute 5% or less in terms of intra-regional trade, which suggests then that extra-regional markets are far more important to OECS economies in the context of exporting. But even in that context, when I address that matter later, you recognize that the OECS economies are not globally competitive in merchandise trade, for instance. Upper middle income economies, but over the last 2 decades, you've seen a decline in the rate at which per capita incomes within the OECS economies have grown from a 5% growth rate in the 80s to it's in some cases almost nearly not growing at all to 2% growth increases in per capita income growth, mirroring the slowness and the tepid nature of economic growth over the last decade or more within the OECS. And fundamentally, we remain very vulnerable type economies to global economic shocks, environmental occurrences, hurricanes, for instance, and the context of climate change, for instance, have become a major challenge and deterrent to economic growth and the sustainability of high levels of growth within the OECS. So I wanted to start first with just a pictorial view, if you like, of the overall fiscal performance of the OECS. Of course, data here retrieved from the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank and focus being more than just the Economic Union members, but broader Eastern Caribbean Currency Union. And I have some messages here in terms of what is observed. So for instance, what is clearly observed is that current expenditure is a major component of central government bills. And if you look at the first graph here, I'm hoping that my laser pen actually is working. You'll see the extent to which central government current expenditure has been increasing over the last 2 decades in comparison to the extent to which capital expenditure, and we need more capital expenditure to boost the sort of capacity among OECS economies, but look at the extent to which capital expenditures have been increasing. And what is also observed in the second graph, for instance, is that every time that we have major shocks, the primary balance and the overall balance decline, and the year by year primary balance decline. You know, it is true for the global financial crisis, wrong here. It is certainly true for the most recent crisis, which we're still in terms of COVID-19, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the impact that it has had in terms of supply chain disruptions. And now we're talking about potentially further impact, bearing in mind the ongoing Ukraine-Russia war. And also important to note is that debt servicing has continued an upward trajectory over the last 2 decades. Debt to GDP ratios continue to be elevated. We've moved from a 58.65% debt to GDP ratio in 2019 to 79.36% debt to GDP ratio in 2021. Of course, one must factor in the reality that at the same time, you had significant contraction in GDP, which would have also given rise to a higher debt to GDP ratio, even if governments were to move in the direction of not increasing their debt stock. But notwithstanding this reality, debt has continued to increase. And so where you had a case where 2 or 3 of the members of the ECCU, St. Lucia included, had obtained the the below 60% GDP debt ratio that the ECCB considered to be prudent, you now have, from my last recollection, but one member state, so that is below this 60% debt to GDP ratio. In fact, the ECCB has resorted to increasing the period within which member states within the ECCU are expected to reach that 60% debt to GDP ratio from 2030 to 2045 at this point in time. And so essentially we have this reality which explains the fiscal position of a lot of the economies. And of course, if I may just go back quickly, the debt servicing and the increasing and the extent to which there's increased debt servicing continues to be an important concern that requires immediate fix, if you like. So why is fiscal stability a challenge? And, you know, it's like being in a state of, where the expectation is that if you continue to do the same thing, you would get a different result. The fundamental fact is the fiscal stability challenge is a much broader challenge that needs to be looked at, and there needs to be a serious rethinking of the economic development model, serious rethinking of the economic structure of OECS economies in order to reposition these economies to a point where even government can improve on their fiscal position. So what is the reality? So the reality is we are not growing well. We're growing too slow. We did very well in the 80s, certainly on the basis of growth in banana exports in many of the territories, particularly in the Windward Islands, St. Lucia, Grenada, St. Vincent and Grenadines, Dominica, sugar, St. Kitts and Nevis. But since the post-WTO environment and the 2000s, the last 2 decades, you'll find that growth has declined tremendously. So you're talking about a 5% growth in the 80s to now 2%, 3%, and some economies clearly are doing in the OECS doing better than the others. And it's something that we need to look at. So what's happening with growth? What's happening with the economic structure? You have a case where agriculture, for instance, in the 80s contributed roughly about 9% to GDP. Of course, that varies across the member states, to now 2.86% in the context of the 2019 figures, which might be a slightly increased now, but not so significantly increased, right? You have, you know, the reality that manufacturing in the 80s, especially light goods manufacturing, many of the OECS countries would have had several factory shells, and piggybacking on the geographical closeness and the policy of the US government to facilitate the export of light goods manufacturing products. At the time in the 80s, being 6% of GDP on average, to now 3.4% or less in some cases. And so
Henry,
we need to look
you
at,
have about 5 minutes left.
yeah, so you have to look at what's going on. Tourism has been seen as a significant driver of economic growth and development. And consequently, in the context of COVID-19, we found ourselves being caught with our pants down because of the reality that faced travel, movement of persons because of a pandemic, and consequently leading to many of the economies that are tourism dependent. Antigua, St. Kitts, St. Lucia in particular declined by over 20%. I think it was 21% decline in growth in 2020 as a consequence of the impact of the pandemic. I've spoken somewhat about the agriculture sector and changes here in the manufacturing sector. The lack of global competitiveness in merchandise trade remains a challenge. And so you have the reality where when in the 80s, Caribbean seas in general, which includes the OECS, would have contributed about 0.5% in global merchandise trade, now contributing 0.04%, a 92% decline in such trade. And so what's the takeaway here? The takeaway is that we've been experiencing slow economic growth. We heavily dependent on one export sector. Government remains a major employer within the formal sector. You have government's contribution to gross investment. Public debt is elevated. You have the continuous need for economic diversification and economic positioning. And of course, governments need to continue to advance those efforts to diversify the economy, because the economic repositioning that is needed would in fact support the effort of governments to improve its fiscal position. So where do we go from here? I spoke about low intra-regional trade. There's clearly a need to strengthen regional integration. And the question is not whether regional integration is important. The question is, how do we get more regional integration? How do we get the CARICOM single market economy to work? How do we get the OECS Economic Union to work so that we could see larger share of intra-regional trade, for instance? How do we connect our economies? And how do we connect our sectors internally? How do we improve and enhance the competitiveness of the medium-sized enterprises within our economies to compete on a global scale? And hence the need for enhanced digitalization of the economy, which is the next factor, the next growth factor that we need to consider. How do we then accelerate economic diversification? Several of the OECS economies are now exploring how do they benefit from the green, blue, orange economic sectors. In particular, during the heart of COVID-19, St. Kitts and Nevis was able to benefit in terms of the film industry. Right? How do we make sure that this is not a one-off event, for instance? How do we ensure that countries like Dominica benefit from geothermal, where the government is advancing investments in geothermal capacity? And then the fourth here, how do we create opportunities for the economic employment of the youth, but really opportunities for the youth within the economy? How do we enhance the education opportunities for young people and build skills that are required in the regional labor market and the international space? These are the sort of policy prescriptions and policy initiatives that are required. And essentially, a lot of these have begun taking place. What we need to do is accelerate the rate at which those measures are taking place. I want to thank you very much, and I push back.
Thank you so much, Dr. Henry, for your brief overview of the OECS microstates. On average, these countries are very tiny states with just a population within the OES of 6,000, limited resources, limited economic competitiveness, high tourism dependency, escalating GDP ratios and servicing, and the need for growth that is based on alternatives such as diversification, digitalization, skill development, and emphasizing resources outside of our land bases, so the blue, which is marine resources, or the orange economy, which is our creative industries. So pointing the way forward as to how it is that we can release the income constraint that would help us to reduce our susceptibility to these shocks and also make it easier for us to have fiscal sustainability. I wanted to take a short moment to welcome our director, Professor Aldra Henry Lee, who has joined us as well on this platform. So I now turn to our next speaker, who is Dr. Kevin Williams, who is Senior Fellow, Development Economist at the University of West Indies, SALISES, Mona. Kevin, over to you.
Right. Over the past 10 years, our political leaders, they suddenly realized that the Jamaican economy needed to move forward. So both sides of the political divide, they came together, form a consensus around moving the Jamaica economy forward. And we have seen the benefits to the Jamaican economy when political leaders when they come together. And so, so 2 years ago, before COVID-19 hit the Jamaican economy, there was this general view that Jamaica, the economic trajectory that Jamaica was on was the right path, was the right direction in which the economy was going. So COVID-19 sort of slowed down the Jamaican economy over the past 2 years, and that sort of stalled some of the initiatives that were in place. So where is the Jamaican economy now? As the Jamaican economy able to choke off the adverse effects of COVID-19? So let's look at some numbers that we have here. The economic growth, the projection is that come March 2022, Jamaican economy should realize economic growth within the ballpark of say 7 to 9%. Debt to GDP ratio should be somewhere between say around 94 to 96%, coming from a high of 110% in March 2021. The expectation is that the debt to GDP ratio would go down, say by 2027, 2028 to about 60%. Okay, that is the aspiration. If we can get debt to GDP ratio to that level, then that will free up a lot of fiscal space for the Jamaican economy to finance infrastructure, to finance education, and to provide support for police services, to finance healthcare, and therefore we should that fiscal space should power the economy forward. Job recovery, unemployment went down from about a high of 8.9% to about 7% in October, up to October 2021. Inflation, however, is still relatively high. It is outside the band of the BOJ target. Okay, the trade balance is about 2 percentage point surplus. Okay, so all these numbers, when you look at these numbers, the growth projection, debt to GDP ratio, unemployment rate, the trade balance, it might suggest that the economy, the Jamaican economy, is recovering relatively okay. Okay, so these numbers might suggest that, and therefore there is the possibility of some flexibility in the Jamaica financing to free up resources to provide infrastructure support and so on. So let's take a snapshot of the 2022 2023 fiscal targets. Okay, from the allocation of the budget is about say 912 billion Jamaican dollars. Debt to GDP ratio, debt servicing from that 912 billion projected expenditure allocation is about 34%, 33.7%. Spending on salary and wages, the largest chunk is about 59%. Capital expenditure, the smallest amount, 7%. Please note, however, this 7% is an increase of about 20% over fiscal year 2021-2022. So there is a realization by our authority that we need to increase capital expenditure in order to provide the support for investment. Okay, and that is noteworthy in the budget, an increase in capital expenditure of 20%. All right, so let's move forward now. So where are we going to get that support to support the Jamaican budget? Well, taxes and grants will amount to about 82% of the overall projected expenditure. Loan about 13.6%, and loan receipt, by the way, to the government, that is loans made by the government, income from those loans will provide 33.6% of the budget, and an unspent cash balance of 0.6%. Yes, the government is spending less than its projection. An unspent balance of 0.6% would make up the overall source of funding for the Jamaican So one thing to note, okay, is that one key innovation, and it is an innovation because you already see things like these happen in the Jamaican economy. There is no new tax. There is no new tax. Okay, there is a realization that the government needs to support small and medium, small and micro enterprises, because these firms account for the largest share of employment. Okay, there is the realization that the government needs to support innovations in the economy, and so the government intends to provide grant funding to startup firms. Okay, those firms that are scalable, those firms that are able to generate new ideas and therefore with overall long-term benefits to the economy. Okay, so let's look. Okay, so that is a sort of whirlwind of where we are, and suddenly some realization that, you know, things that we need to do, where we are, things that we need to do to move forward, move the Jamaican economy forward. But from my perspective, what are some of the headwinds that await the Jamaican economy? Okay, and those of us who are following up what's going on in the globe, interest rate is rising in developed economies as a result of the war between Ukraine and Russia. Okay, we see commodity prices increasing. Now, increasing interest rate is a serious disadvantage to the Jamaican economy, and this is why that is serious for the Jamaican economy. Okay, Jamaica is a developing country. Okay, and when investors decide to invest in Jamaica, Jamaica has to pay an interest rate premium. Now, the reason why Jamaica has to pay an interest rate premium is that the environment is questionable because of being a developing country. Okay, that is not the case with advanced economies. So when the interest rate goes up in, say, the US, Western Europe, investors will consider those environments relatively safer than the environment in developing countries, and therefore to discourage investors moving from Jamaica to safer developed economies, Jamaica will have to pay a premium to retain and encourage investors to keep their funds in Jamaica. Okay, high interest rate in developed countries has the potential to drain the Jamaican economy of its hard foreign currency. That is the national reserve. Okay, high interest rate has the potential to generate to result in depreciation of the Jamaican economy as investors move their funds out of Jamaica. We expect the value of Jamaican dollar to go down. If the value of Jamaican dollar goes down, we expect imports, okay, to the price of imports to increase. However, there's an advantage in depreciation. That is the price of our exports will reduce. Okay, but here's the thing: if a country has nothing to export, then a depreciated currency in and of itself is not valuable to that economy. Okay, now the Jamaican economy is not able to feed itself, and so when there's an increase in commodity prices, that has the potential to drain the Jamaican economy again of its hard foreign currency. Okay, so these, in my view, are two serious headwinds that the Jamaican economy, our political authority, will have to contend with. Okay, so what's the way forward?
Okay.
So what's the way forward? Policy predictability is an important factor for countries like Jamaica. For a developing country in general, policy predictability is key. Okay, we have seen for the last 10 years that Jamaica is capable of demonstrating to the world that we can create an environment that is business friendly, that is predictable, okay, right across political lines, right across political administration. Okay, modernization of agriculture is a key potential area that the Jamaican economy has not exploited. Okay, the advantage of modernizing agriculture is that you can feed yourself, and so when there is a price shock, for example, what's going on now with commodity prices, that you expect, if you're able to modernize your agriculture sector, that can sort of absorb adverse shocks associated with high commodity prices. Okay, Jamaica is in the tropics. Okay, and therefore the expectation is that they could make better use of wind and sun and so in order to generate energy. Okay, and that could save, in my view, that could save the country of valuable hard foreign currency. Okay, the debt to GDP ratio, if you can bring the debt to GDP ratio to some respectable level, that can create fiscal space for, as I said before, for capital expenditure, that can create fiscal space to develop your healthcare system, that can create fiscal space to create your human capital in terms of education, and so on. So taking the debt to GDP ratio at a respectable level is key for developing countries like Jamaica. Now, the reason why the level of the debt to GDP ratio is important for a developing country is because of the potential risk of default when debt to GDP ratio reaches a certain level. Japan, for example, debt to GDP ratio is above 100%, yet because Japan has the capacity to pay, to honor its debt, that is not a problem. Okay, but country like Jamaica, when their debt to GDP ratio reaches a certain level, there is a red flag. Kenneth Rogoff and Carmen Reynaud, they have a number suggesting that when you reach that level, somewhere between, Jamaica is at that level now, about 95, 96% debt ratio, then there is an expectation that the country will default. Okay, so it is important that the Jamaican economy brings down its debt to GDP ratio in order to take advantage of the fiscal flexibility that lower debt to GDP ratio will provide.
Thank you, Kevin. You have around 1 minute to wrap up.
Okay, and also we expect an acceleration in digitization of public services so as to generate inefficiency, reduces distortion, and so on. And we expect in my view, the most serious threat to the Jamaican economy is, this 10,000 pound elephant in the room, i.e. crime and violence. There is some estimate that crime and violence is costing the country somewhere in the region of 4% of its overall output. So those are my thoughts for now. I'll take questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Williams, emphasizing some of the challenges, the headwinds, as he points out, in terms of higher interest rates, the higher commodity prices, as well as crime and violence, and emphasizing a conservative path forward, reducing the debt to GDP ratios, and emphasizing the movement towards modernization of key sectors such as agricultural sector to reduce pressure on food imports, as well as emphasizing the need for renewable energy sources to reduce pressure on our oil import bills, both of which are impacted by the interest rate differentials that may emerge between developing and developed countries that could lead to outward flows of capital and a decrease in international reserves. So those are very important points highlighted by Dr. Williams on Jamaica's economic fiscal spaces and some threats, some trends and trajectories. I now wish to turn over the floor to Dr. Dillon Alleyne, who is the Deputy Director of ECLAC, who will speak to an appropriate fiscal policy for post-COVID-19 Caribbean. Over to you, Dillon.
Thank you, Pat. And it's a pleasure to be here. As you say, I'm answering the question, what is the appropriate fiscal policy for a post-COVID world? The IMF chief in a recent blog said that there were 3 prerequisites for recovery. One was health and wellness. The second was the inflationary impact, addressing it. And thirdly, she said it was fiscal consolidation. I think this is too narrow from a Caribbean perspective. I want to point out, first of all, that we have a triple crisis, and some of this has been addressed already, and that our preoccupation has to be rescue, reconstruction, and repositioning. And the triple crisis is driven by the health concerns, which is still with us, fiscal consolidation and debt reduction. I want to say something about that later. And the anemic growth, which has been, which is Caribbean-wide. And by the way, my analysis is on the Caribbean as a whole. Anemic growth, which didn't begin with COVID, but began with the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. And of course, our environmental vulnerability. So we face a triple crisis. And any kind of fiscal policy that will address these must ask the question, what are our needs? Well, the health crisis is still with us, and if you look on the left where I look at the number of persons who died, unfortunately, and on the right, we look at population fully vaccinated. We see that the situation is still dire. People are still dying, led by Trinidad and Tobago. Many countries, the vaccine hesitancy is a big problem. A good example of how vaccine help is the Cayman Islands, which has the lowest deaths and the highest vaccination rate. So this is a challenge which we still have to confront. We must link COVID-19 deaths and challenge with NCDs. We have some of the highest incidents of NCDs in the world. As a matter of fact, 2/3 of our people die from NCDs, and this is a challenge. Of course, there are other issues with respect to health, limited COVID testing, limited bed space in isolation, overcrowding and inadequate sanitary living conditions. These are things that complicate the challenge, and these are things which we have to address going forward as part of our repositioning, as part of our reconstruction. The education sector, as you know, was badly damaged, and heroic efforts were made to address the education gaps. But despite those efforts, it's clear that large numbers of households are not interconnected, and many children were not offered the opportunity for online learning. And worse among those were people from migrant communities and people with disabilities who did not have the appropriate technology. So this is an area that requires tremendous effort going forward. First is a resilience strategy to address the more pandemics, which will certainly be upon us. And I think it's unfortunate that ministries of education are only preoccupied with going back to school. I think there is an opportunity here for using a hybrid system, which will allow us to be resilient in the next pandemic. So in the social sphere, we had very great challenges. Of course, many programs were innovated and existing programs expanded, but the bottom line was that in the social sphere, it was not sufficient, despite all the relief measures taken. And a good indicator of this is a study of 8 Caribbean countries, which was reported by Fitzroy Henry in 2021, November, where you look at household income per week, and you look at the percentage of respondents who receive assistance, and you see that as the income level rises, the percentage of persons who receive government assistance went up, which is contrary to what you would expect. And this is because the nature of the pandemic meant that many people could not be reached, and this is something that we have to account for. Touching on debt, on economic growth, ECLAC has made some projections. Clearly, in 2020, we suffered severely, and in 2021, it is expected that the economy will regionally, the region as a whole will grow by 7.8%. But it's important to understand what these numbers mean. This growth does not return us to pre-COVID levels. And this is the important point, that even though we see significant growth of 5% and 6%, it doesn't return us to what we were in 2019. And of course, the tourism performance has been very uneven as countries begin to open up, and the overall impact in 2021 was negative 11.8% growth in tourism arrivals. Not surprising. I come to the debt, and this has been touched on by our 2 presenters, and I want to make 2 critical points here. I think there's an overemphasis on the debt stock. The debt stock is about past sins, put it roughly. What we should be focused on is new debt, is new funds. We should look at the dynamic of new funds and how they are spent. And we are being driven by the IMF and to some extent the World Bank in this preoccupation. But I think it's not helpful. What is important is the new issuance of debt and how we spend it in terms of the rate of return versus the cost. So I just want to say that on that issue, that the preoccupation is very much misplaced. I'm not saying that it's not important to reduce the debt, but I'm saying that there is not where the dynamics of the economy lie. And by the way, debt services, it's really the debt service that is the issue and not so much the debt stock. And as been pointed out before, some countries carry very high debt for a long time. And by the way, the Caribbean has been in debt and has come out of debt and has gone back into debt. So this idea that debt reduction is a continuous process is not so. Jamaica is a good example of a country continuously going into high debt. At one time, it was about 191% of GDP. So we have to ask the question, why is this continuous engagement with taking on high debt? And I think it has a lot to do with the structure of the economy. FDI inflows, as you know, FDI is very important to these economies, have not done very well since the global crisis of 2008, 2009. So I don't want to give the impression that the challenges, growth and FDI has to do with COVID. It's a longer term issue which we face. I wanted to look at tax revenue because there is a optimism that with the economic conditions improving, tax revenue will expand. This is tax revenue from 2011 to 2020 for the Caribbean, remain virtually flat. I mean, there may be explanations for this, but the point is it has remained flat. Gross fixed capital formation, which is very critical to economic growth, has remained flat from 2000 to 2020 in the Caribbean. And that has enormous implications. First of all, the reason why capital expenditure is depressed in the Caribbean is that governments are using capital expenditure as an adjustment mechanism because of the political consequences of touching recurrent spending. So this is the problem. There's been a retrenchment on the capital side, and that is linked back to the consequence of debt, but not so much the debt stock, but what we're doing with new debt issuance and how it affects returns to investment. Exports of goods and services, as you know, exports are the lifeblood of these economies, continue to be flat for all the Caribbean countries, except for Guyana, where Guyana, by the way, is in an exceptional circumstance. And I think we should see Guyana's fortune as the Caribbean's good fortune as well. I don't have time to investigate that here. And of course, unemployment rates have over 2010 to 2020 have been depressed, especially unemployment among youth and women. If you look at the unemployment rate for Jamaica, for example, there's been a historical divide between men and women, which has not closed over 2 decades. And for the rest of the Caribbean, the unemployment rate for youth in some places about 26%. So that while we are still a relatively young population, we are not benefiting from the youth dividend. And that comes back to the education system, which in my view is a disaster throughout the Caribbean. And the evidence is clear on that. I wouldn't say anything about the vulnerability to natural disasters, but let me say that while the headline natural disasters of hurricanes tend to be well publicized, there are floods, droughts, and so on, which are equally impactful. And many governments have complained that the CRIF is not sufficient to address this vulnerability. So this is a serious challenge which we have to factor in our analysis if the Caribbean is going to be repositioning itself. Let me say something on the war. Clearly, inflation rates are going to go up. Russia and Ukraine and Ukraine export 19 and 10% of globally traded wheat. So immediately you see that prices are going to go up for cereals. Export prohibition on Russia will increase energy and grain prices. This will increase costs for fixed income earners, throwing more people into poverty in energy dependent economies. But although I know a colleague is going to talk about Trinidad and Tobago, but they have not significantly benefited from this increase in oil prices because of the investment that has been made or lack of investment in the oil sector. Energy exporters will benefit, but this will also be accompanied by higher agricultural prices and inputs. And I did comment some years ago of preoccupation of the Bank of Jamaica with inflation targeting. And I did say that you can't target inflation if all the marbles for targeting inflation are external. And this is what you see immediately, that the inflation rate has already breached the, I'm not saying that nothing could be done, but I'm saying it's almost a foolish errand to talk about inflation targeting when most of the factors are external, including energy prices, cereals, and so on. But I think much could be done to help the poor and the vulnerable. Farmers will benefit from higher output prices, but these will be offset by higher input prices, fertilizers, and so on. So income support is necessary. Let me end with looking at some domestic policies and look at what might be possible in the external end. The health crisis has not left us. Don't let us forget that. And we see what's happening in Hong Kong with new variants and so on. So we must focus on sustainable health, including reducing NCDs. And reducing NCDs don't require large amounts of resources. It's education, it's information. We must support an industrial policy to develop new sectors focused on investment in the domestic capital making sector. And I've said this before. This is the sector that generates knowledge. It is knowledge that will allow us to go up the value chain. It is knowledge that will allow us to reform agriculture. So when we say modernizing agriculture, what we're talking about is knowledge creation in the agricultural sector. And as part of this focusing on investment in the domestic capital making sector, it means using education and health as global exports. We cannot be located close to the United States with such a vast demand in health and not benefit from it. It's an easy market. And so part of the restructuring must be an effort to capture some of that market. But the Achilles heel of all these economies is lack of access to low-cost long-term development finance. And ECLAC has been working on developing what is called a Caribbean Resilience Fund, which is a vehicle to lure long-term low-cost finance to the Caribbean. And we've had a discussion with the president of the CDB recently on this, and he's very excited. As a matter of fact, he's thinking about something much more elaborate. But we need a resilience fund to capture, for example, the 50 billion in private capital that is idle in the commercial banks and require risk instruments for their incentivization. So this is a big issue, how we access finance at low cost, both international and domestic. We must invest in interconnection at all levels, and I think colleagues have talked about this. But we must not invest in interconnection just in terms of the education sector, in terms of the health sector. We want an ICT backbone that interconnects all sectors and all communities. And here is an opportunity with e-governance, which would incentivize the private sector to invest in activities. So, and e-governance means also a resilient strategy for the next pandemic. We also need to build—
Dr. Alleyne, you have to wrap up.
Yes. Finally, we need to build fiscal buffers to address the external shocks. And finally, I want to say that current budgetary policies and strategies are too hierarchical and centralized. We don't talk about gender budgeting, and submissions from community organizations must be part of this repositioning. And we must use PRs, public expenditure reviews, to assess the value for money in terms of public spending. It's not just spending, but are we getting value for money? and orient our public spending to meet these needs which I've identified. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you so much, Dr. Alleyne. Brilliant presentations for all our presenters so far, and the work that Dr. Alleyne has emphasized is for us to focus on the longer term issues, not to get locked into stock dynamics, but to look at differentials in terms of new debt, but most importantly, to disaggregate some of these effects and to think through how it is that we're going to mobilize our education and health resources towards making ourselves less prone to disadvantages of small size and low growth, and more equipped to deal with the 21st century. Certainly one of the key points has been his emphasis on the Achilles heel, which is in the Caribbean, which is the lack of access to long-term, low-cost development finance. So this idea of a Caribbean Resilience Fund, perhaps complementing the green climate funds, and the question of how it is that the distribution of burdens and losses in climate change need to be redressed through appropriate financing mechanisms that are climate just, is a very complementary strategy to this emphasis on low cost, long-term finance. Very strong views identified here of making our fiscal policies less hierarchical and more gender sensitive, and that there should be reviews where we get value for money. I think if we were to implement any few of those longer term structural shifts emphasized by Dr. Alleyne, we would certainly be in a transformational space. So Dr. Alleyne has set up the ball very nicely for our last batter, who is gender sensitive, Dr. Preeya Mohan, coming from the Caribbean small island, but very rich in resources of Trinidad and Tobago. So we'll have a woman in this conversation, panel conversation, before we open it up to the floor. Preeya, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, everyone. Thank you to SALISES for organizing this event and inviting me to speak. I'm very happy to speak this afternoon. Also, thank you for my fellow panelists. You have set up the forum very nicely for me to end. A lot of what you would have spoken about, I would build on in my presentation. Of course, I would take a view of looking at the case of Trinidad and Tobago, although the lessons would apply to Caribbean islands in general. So let's begin with the global outlook. The pre-Ukraine war outlook, going into the second year of the COVID-19 pandemic, the IMF would have expected global growth to moderately decline from 5.9% in 2021 to 4.4% in 2022, with further reductions of 3.8% in 2023. And these downward projections are being made because of problems with the Build Back Better policy in the United States, and of course, China's zero COVID-19 policy, where we've been seeing very strict lockdowns. Now with the Ukraine war, the outlook is going to show us the global economy is going to experience much slower growth, with much faster inflation. So what we're having is an adverse shock to inflation and a lower GDP amid already elevated price pressures and low growth in the global economy. Now, why is the Ukraine war of such importance to us in the Caribbean and of course the world in general? Russia is the world's third largest oil producer behind the United States and Saudi Arabia. Russia is also the world's largest exporter of oil to the global market and is the second largest crude oil exporter behind Saudi Arabia. Now, the Ukraine and Russia make up 30% of global exports of wheat. This is a point Dr. Alleyne would have made earlier. Now, coming out of all of these things, we're going to experience three adverse shock flows through three main channels here. We're going to have higher prices for commodities such as food and energy. This will only serve to further increase inflation, which of course is going to reduce income, it's going to erode wealth, it's going to reduce demand, and of course increase food insecurity and affect those most vulnerable in society. We're going to also have disrupted trade, supply chains, and remittances, along with a historic surge in refugees. And lastly, we're going to have reduced business confidence and higher investor uncertainty. And this is going to, of course, negatively affect asset prices. It's going to lead to the tightening of financial conditions and potentially capital outflows from emerging markets. Now, what does this mean for the economy, the global economy in general? Economies reliant on oil imports will, of course, see wider fiscal and trade deficits and higher inflation. Now, oil and gas exporters may benefit from these higher prices, and I would speak to this specific case of Trinidad, why we may or actually may not benefit. Also, the IMF is going to have further revised downward projections. But of course, we do not know what these projections are going to be yet because of very high uncertainty. We're not sure of what further sanctions are going to be implemented. And of course, we're not sure how long this war is going to last. So it's very difficult for us to say what our growth forecast for the world economy is going to look like. And of course, we're going to have much longer term implications out of this war. This war is going to alter our global economic and geopolitical order. We're going to have energy trade shifts, supply chains reconfiguring, payment networks are fragmenting, and countries are going to rethink their reserve currency holdings. We're going to, of course, have economic fragmentation, particularly with regard to trade and technology. Now, let's get to the Trinidad and Tobago context. In Trinidad and Tobago, we're very heavily dependent on the energy sector. The energy sector makes up just about 36% of our GDP, 78% of our exports, and it contributes about 23% to our government revenue. So we've been discussing higher oil prices and higher gas prices, which could potentially have positive effects for an oil and gas producer like Trinidad and Tobago. Now, since the 1990s, the energy sector in Trinidad and Tobago has moved from oil dominant to a natural gas dominant sector. Now, our natural gas production has actually been on a decline, and the third quarter of 2021 would have seen a 17% decrease in natural gas production. We've had the closure of Atlantic LNG Train 1, and we've also had reduced utilization rates at our other LNG trains, and this would have caused about a 49% drop in LNG production over the third quarter of 2021. Looking at our gas production, our oil production, we've had the closure of our oil refinery, Preeya, and our crude oil production registered just about 9% of growth over the third quarter of 2021. So given the scenario of higher energy prices, given our falling production rates, they may not be sufficient to offset any increase in price to compensate, to create any kind of buffers for us at the moment. Looking now at our growth outlook for the region, the IMF would have predicted a 1% contraction for 2021. This is bearing in mind that pre-COVID-19, since 2018, we've been having 0 to negative growth. Now this 1% contraction for 2021 may have to be revised further downward. We've also had a prediction for 2022 of a 4% growth. Again, we're going to probably see a revision of this growth projection, which is more likely to come down closer to 0 or even negative. But again, too many uncertainties for us to determine what that figure is going to look like for 2022. If we look at our public finance, our budgeting figures, we would see that pre-COVID-19, since 2018, we've been running budget deficits. So we've been having higher expenditure than revenue. And what we can expect is that for the 2023 budget, we would probably expect a further budget deficit, which has been financed mainly through borrowing, which would potentially increase our debt going forward. Now, looking at some other economic indicators for the country, we're seeing that our economic indicators are definitely not headed in the direction where we would want them to go. We've been seeing a rise in unemployment. We've been seeing falling net official reserves. Our business and consumer loans have been decreasing. Consumer spending has been decreasing, and our energy and non-energy activity has also been decreasing. Now, looking at our ease of doing business index, we are ranked at 105, which is not the best place to be. So this means that it's a bit difficult to do business in the country. And we see that in doing business in the country, areas that can be kind of problematic include the paying of taxes, which of course affects our government revenue collection, together with trading across borders, dealing with construction permits, enforcing contracts, etc. So we're seeing a weak performance going forward, even pre-COVID-19, and as we now face the shocks of the Ukraine war. Looking at the COVID-19 situation, of course, it has been said by my other panelists that the COVID-19 situation is not going anywhere. The economy is fully reopened as of this month. We've been seeing deaths and new cases on the decline. But what is a bit of concern is that our vaccine rates would have more or less plateaued, where about 50% of the population being fully vaccinated. And of course, we've been living through the pandemic now, and we know that the possibility of new variants exists. So looking at the national budget or public finance in Trinidad and Tobago, of course, it's very challenging. Given all of these uncertainties caused by COVID-19 and the Ukraine war, we saw that the pre-COVID-19 economic outlook for the country has not been good. We see the post-lockdown economic outlook together with the Ukraine war creating further stresses on the economy. Yes, for now, oil and gas prices are high, but I would say that they're unstable and we do not know what can happen to these commodity prices in the future. We've been also experiencing massive fiscal shocks, meaning our decline in revenue, our increase in expenditure, because we've been having to sort of prop up the social sector given the implications of COVID-19. And of course, higher debt because of having to borrow to fund this added expenditure. Of course, we have the social impacts, increased poverty, increased unemployment, closure of many businesses. And in the case of Trinidad, unlike the other small island countries, we've been having higher Venezuelan migration into the country. Also, there's a very real psychological impact of living in the pandemic and issues of depression, alcoholism, domestic violence, etc. So the 2021-2022 budget presentation would have been termed resilience in the face of a global pandemic. Now, the 2022-2023 budget is most likely going to be resilience in the face of a global pandemic and war. Looking at some of the numbers from our budget, the projected expenditure would have been about 52 billion, and this would have been an increase from the 45 billion in 2021. Going forward, this expenditure may most likely increase if we need to continue expanding social services given higher food prices, etc. The projected revenue would have been 43 billion. Again, I'm not sure how much our revenue streams are going to increase with the high commodity prices, given the fall in production rates that I would have spoken about earlier in the energy sector. So that fiscal deficit of about 5.8% of GDP may more than likely increase next year. In terms of the sectors, education would have been given the largest share, followed by health. I see this combination remaining more or less the same going forward. Now, the question that we need to ask ourselves is, what is the post-COVID-19 and war recovery strategy for Trinidad and Tobago and for Caribbean small island development states in general? And These issues I would speak to one by one. My colleagues would have already touched on them. So the areas we're going to look at would be green growth, the blue economy, agri-tech, digital transformation, SMEs, and entrepreneurship. I'm going to end with some few words on goal setting and development planning. Now, in the Trinidad and Tobago budget, the budget would have been linked to what we call the roadmap to recovery. So it's very important that in public financing, we do have a wider development strategy to link our revenue and expenditures against. And of course, some of these elements are captured in the potential growth poles that I spoke about earlier, and we'll go through each one of them individually, and I would speak to each one of them in some more detail. Now, looking at the issue of
Sorry
green
to
growth,
interrupt you, Preeya, just to let you know you have around 2 minutes to wrap up.
Sure. So looking at the area of green growth is important for small island economies because, of course, it fights climate change. We can better manage natural capital, protect our environment, etc. In the Trinidad and Tobago budget, what would have been done? There would have been a customs duty and VAT removal on the importation of batteries and a 30% tax credit for companies involved in carbon capture. Now, a green growth strategy is much more comprehensive than that, and it involves looking at our inputs, production, output, and consumption, and how we green these aspects. In looking at green growth, we can also speak to greening of tourism. And it's important to green tourism because tourism is a major consumer of energy and water. And tourism is also a major contributor to employment in the economy of Tobago. Now, in our case of Trinidad and Tobago, there are plans for a new luxury hotel to be constructed in Tobago. Of course, we're not sure how green it's going to be, but a green tourism product should include social goals, economic goals, and of course, our environmental goals. Looking briefly at the blue economy, of course, ocean resources are 2 times the size of the landmass in small island developing economies. So it's important to look at the blue economy. The Trinidad and Tobago budget spoke about the development of ports, but of course, a blue economy strategy is much more than that. It involves conserving and restoring the ocean, sustainable and traceable seafood, sustainable tourism, curbing ocean pollution, greening of ports, and of course, harnessing renewable energy. Looking at food security, what the government did, they would have removed VAT and import duties from basic food items. But of course, we can leverage technology in agriculture across our agri-value chains to improve food production all the way from production supply to market and consumer demand. And touching on digital transformation, we saw some really good policies coming out of the government here, where we had the removal of duties on computers and hardware. We have a national digital ID coming for citizens, a 5% tax reduction or concessions for SMEs that adopt technology solutions, free broadband access and ICT to schools, digital skills trainings, and the connection of underserved communities. But of course, a digital transformation strategy involves e-networks, e-commerce connect, and digital entrepreneurship. So we still have some way to go. We also had a lot of good incentives for SMEs, such as a 5% tax reduction for exporters of local goods, a lot of concessions for loans, but SMEs, of course, need much more support than this in terms of technology, building networks, R&D, organization, marketing, and data. So I'm just getting very close to wrapping up here because I want to touch on the important aspect of goal setting and development planning. Because I did note that our public finance should be linked to some sort of development strategy. And I would like to end by saying that the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, can be used as a framework to guide our recovery out of the COVID-19 pandemic and the Ukraine war crisis. Okay, policymakers are increasingly seeing the value in scaling up action and commitment around the SDGs. But in doing this, what we need is a policy coherence and a strategy going forward. And what we require would be political commitment, long-term vision, policy integration, policy coordination, local involvement, stakeholder engagement, policy impacts, and of course, monitoring and reporting. So I'd like to wrap it up here and take questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mohan, for a very comprehensive, detailed examination of the challenges and bringing to light some of the paradoxes, the contradictions in the Trinidadian experience against the context of global turbulence. And you were very, very effective in highlighting the multidimensional nature of these global shocks, from food and energy to international asset prices, as well as currency holdings and the repercussions of those into the practical elements of our fiscal and trade increasing fiscal and trade deficits. So this has been a very rich contribution. Certainly, one of the things that we should probe more in this conversation is whether or not having the resources such as an oil-rich Trinidad or an oil-rich Ghana actually helps us towards meeting our sustainable development goals. There seems to be, even within the capacities that exist for appropriate fiscal expenditures on social and economic goods, there's still in the case of Trinidad, we see things like multidimensional challenges in social, economic, and health, which was one of the strong emphases of Dr. Alleyne. So some of these multidimensional movements in the wrong direction within Trinidad and Tobago, even though they have those resource cushions and would benefit from any sort of you know, the change in oil prices in increasing a kind of surplus asset being generated without necessarily change in productive activities or change in economic modes of production. So very rich presentations. Certain fundamental questions have been raised in my mind about all of our goals towards the SDGs. And for those who are joining us, welcome. We're speaking to the issues of sustainable public financing in the context of these multiple stressors and how do we achieve our SDG agendas and our national local development agendas. I'll ask you to put your questions in the Q&A box or in the chat. We have our first question from Professor Lee, and she's asking, how can we ensure that the most vulnerable in society recover from the negative impact of the pandemic? What will be more inclusive and targeted social protection strategies look like? And I would really like each of our panelists to respond to that. And to piggyback on that question, to ask whether or not it is feasible, given that challenge that Professor Lee has thrown out about how do we support our vulnerable populations, disaggregated to look at things like disabilities or diverse abilities and gender dynamics. How feasible is it to do that in the context of our current debt to GDP targets for 2035 being, I think, 60%. And in the case of Jamaica, another example, even harder challenge in terms of reducing our debt to GDP ratios to 60% by 2027-28. How feasible are our goals for meeting sustainable development challenges? And this specific question in relationship to vulnerability and how we're going to meet those needs in light of these targets that we have for fiscal prudence?
Okay, let me jump on this question first. My answer is simple and short. You help the vulnerable, you help the disadvantaged segment of your population by growing your economy. When you grow your economy, you provide broad-based support right across the economy. Economic growth rises all boats. Okay, once you grow the economy, it supports everyone in the population. So that is the key for a country like Jamaica. You need to grow the economy. Okay, that's my short answer.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. Any other comments?
Can I say something, Pat? I mean, I think you would expect me to respond to that. Those are textbook University of Chicago, you know, ideas. I don't think they have currency today. Jamaica grew enormously in the 1960s, and it took the Manley administration to bring in a lot of social change. And so many other examples. I'm not knocking growth, but growth has to be broad-based. It has to be pro-poor. It has to be sustained. So I think we must be very careful about this thing about growth raising all boats. It could raise a few boats. And that is why we have problems with per capita income. Now, I think that social programs in the context of fiscal constraints is a problem. Those programs have to be smart. They have to be comprehensive. We have large numbers of people who are working in the informal economy, and those persons don't have access to any kind of protection, and they suffered enormously in this crisis. We have persons with disabilities, and we have systems that don't accommodate them. So I take the point Preeya made that we have to take this SDG seriously. And to be fair, all the governments in the Caribbean have committed to it. But I think there is something else which is lacking, even though we say we have parliamentary democracies. The point is that many of these people have no voice. Voice comes from local government, where people at local community. You can't have a hierarchical system that seeks to address problems everywhere. You need decentralization. When the budget of New York, which has a larger GDP than ours, you know, than Jamaica, say, is being elaborated, there's community participation. So we have to move beyond the economic prerequisites, which are important. I mean, we must have growth, sustainable growth, but we have to have voice too. And we have to look to communities to see what they have also been doing in terms of resilience. It is not, many people are thrown into difficulty because of natural disasters, because of floods and other things. So we have to also draw on the community. It cannot be a one-way thing. Draw on communities to see what they have historically been using. And here is where the universities have a part to play. They must seek to understand what is going on at the level of the community. And we consolidate that, and we digitize it, and we make it more broadly available. So I think that apart from the traditional approaches to social and welfare programs must also be sustainable. They must be designed to make people productive, those who can be productive and engage. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Alleyne. And the floor is still open for other panelists, Preeya and Clarence.
Yes, thanks, Chair. I wanted to just come in and really touch on, and I agree completely that we need to grow the economy. We need broad-based growth. We need, economic strategies that bring everyone into the economic mix. So that's important. But I think we've learned something from COVID-19, and I really hope that our governments do not lose the opportunity to adjust this issue. So several governments went the route of using Social Security and also took loans to facilitate income support. There's a realization that while we have had Social Security schemes and regimes, unemployment benefits, with a few exceptions, I think Barbados being included here. I'm not sure if such obtains in Trinidad and Tobago. Antigua has some sort of a system as well. But many of the countries, especially the OECS, did not have. we need to look at how we could include unemployment benefits into, because again, it was not only the vulnerable that was impacted. There were persons who would have worked for 20 years nonstop who became unemployed because of COVID, right? And that is significant. The other thing too is that we need to have a serious examination of the formal and informal sector. There are way too many persons in the informal sector. And this is particularly interesting with service-based economies too, because you have, for instance, a lot of the taxi drivers and other related tourism workers who don't pay any taxes. And I'm not saying there should be taxes, not saying that's the important thing here. But what is more important is that because of the arrangement, they are not positioned, I put it this way, to contribute to social security schemes. And they are very likely to be vulnerable in circumstances like that. So these are twofold. We need to grow the economy, but we need the structures so that when there needs adjustment, like social security and unemployment benefits, these are there to cushion the blow.
Thank you very much, Clarence. Preeya?
Thank you, Chair. Just one simple solution going forward with in terms of reaching households and inclusiveness, persons with disabilities, etc. I think one advantage of the pandemic, we would have had a lot of disadvantages with the pandemic, but we would have seen some advantage, is the adoption of technology and digitalization going forward. We should not think that we should go back to where we were. I think it's important that we leverage the change in living situations going forward. And I'll give the simple example of children going to school online in Trinidad and Tobago, and of course in a lot of the other Caribbean countries, the governments are very eager to get children back out to school to where we were. And Dr. Alleyne made this point. Now, this may seem counterintuitive, but online schooling actually opens up access to persons without access to actually physically getting into the classroom. And so we should not think post-pandemic, we automatically go back to the world we came from. We really need to sit back and take lessons going forward. And the issue of using the digital technology to educate children, persons with disabilities, is something that we should hold on to. And I'm very happy that the government of Trinidad and Tobago, they are taking steps in terms of increasing ICT access in the communities and in the schools. And I really want to see that continue going forward.
Thank you so much for your very diverse answers in responding to the comments that Professor Lee raised in relationship to how we address the needs of those who are the most vulnerable to help them to recover, and also what would more inclusive and targeted social development strategies look like. And some of the answers have ranged from really looking at our social security mechanisms, for example, unemployment benefits. And in most of the Caribbean territories, we have very weak pension systems, which is not only robs us of long-term patient funds, but also increases the vulnerability of the aged for persons who, as Clarence Henry has noted, Dr. Henry has noted, largely subsist in the informal economy. So these are some structural considerations to be taken into view when policies are being designed to be more inclusive, to be more sensitive to the needs of the vulnerable groups. I also wanted to point out, to throw out a question to the panel about whether or not we should have specific limited, or that's not the correct way to put it, to have minimum expenditure levels in terms of key infrastructural programs and projects. So for example, we know that most Caribbean countries have high levels of debt servicing, up to 60%, 30%. In Jamaica, I think the current debt servicing ratio is, but in Antigua and Barbuda, I think it was mentioned, it was 60%. But how do we, given those high levels of debt servicing costs, how do we allocate resources on a basis of minimum expenditures required in order to recover from the devastation of the COVID multidimensional impacts, which included things like increasing domestic violence, learning losses, health, long-term health, complications from having COVID. How do we, what strategies would you put forward if we were to say there must be some minimum, some allocation strategy that we say, irrespective of our needs to speak to long-term debt management goals, that these are also non-negotiable minimum expenditures on particular kinds of projects which would rebound to the communities and our society's well-being. Does anyone have any views as to whether or not that seems like a way forward to think through the protection of our communities which have vulnerabilities, or other ideas as to how it is that we could, in a tangible way within budgetary expenditures, make some way of signaling what are our basic principles and stands on the protection of our most vulnerable communities and investments in our health and educational requirements for the future. I hope people got the gist of that question, and then I'll go return to the Q&A.
Yeah, if I could make a stab at it. You know, the IMF years ago used to talk about education spending as, you know, recurrent spending. I mean, we've passed that now, and they realize it is really investing in the human capital sector. And I say that to say that we're still in that zone where we don't think that investing in persons, I mean, we speak about it, but investing in persons is really investing in capital. And so that the budgetary policy, as I say, is not influenced by a broader public. It's the Ministry of Finance with the island ministries, and they decide what the priorities are. So to address that problem of minimum requirements, you have to bring in a broader range of stakeholders whose voices could be heard, or else you will end up like what happened with these fiscal rules. They're rules, but we get around them very easily, you know? And of course, they're pressures and necessities that arise from particular circumstances. Obviously, if a hurricane strikes, we have to reallocate spending. But I mean, the question you raise is a profound one, but it has implications to how we do budgetary policy.
Thank you. Any other comments?
If I can jump there, Chair. You know, interestingly, and I was thinking similarly, fiscal rules, how have we performed in that regard? I want to comment on the education sector. I know my colleague panelist, Dr. Alleyne, already did so, but I want to say this much. It has been well thought that in the context of the Caribbean, we spend pretty much on education sector. We've been spending a lot of monies on teacher training. We spend a lot of monies on recurrent expenditure on paying salaries. We have higher rates of graduate teachers within the school system, but we're still not doing well from an education standpoint. In fact, we might be doing worse than we were doing when we had fewer graduates in the school system. So what's the problem? So part of the problem is not just only how much we spend, because we are spending quite a bit. It's also how efficient we spend those resources. And I think it goes to the point of what Dr. Mohan was making with respect to not going back, turning the clock, so to speak, because now that you know, infection rates are declining, we can send everybody back to school and forget about, you know, the benefits of online learning. Because the truth, and the other thing too, is that while you have the online learning, which could potentially be beneficial to revolutionizing the education system, you also have the declining birth rates. And so population rates are declining too, you know? So you have a lot of schools, physical structures that governments don't need anymore, at least not in the current period and in the near future. So some of those savings that can be realized by having a hybrid approach to education system can now be also reallocated to supporting other social programs without necessarily, you know, pushing the debt any higher. So I think that is something that we need to look at, see how feasible it is to do so. And then, but the question of what the value of the amount of the budget that should be allocated is an open one, but I think it has to be sufficient, it has to be efficiently used, and we need to use all all what's available to us, the benefits to reduce our recurrent expenditure in other areas to create fiscal space to support the social area.
Excellent comments. Preeya, did you have a point, or Kevin?
Yeah,
Yes.
let me give a stab at it. It's not clear to me whether you should prioritize education above security, or education and security above healthcare provision and so on. Okay, it's not clear to me. In my mind, they are important and they intersect with each other. What is important, however, is to create the flexibility in your fiscal account so that you can provide adequate spending on these different items, because they all work together to move the economy forward. So you need to create the right policies in place, okay? Create the right rules in place so that when people break them, they are punished. When people follow the rules, they are rewarded, and so on. Okay, so you need to bring down the debt, generate decent policies so that we can realize economic growth, and therefore you will have the fiscal flexibility to support all these important line expenditure.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Preeya?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I think governments in the Caribbean want to have social expenditure and take care of their population. What we require. Are you hearing me? Yes.
I could hear you, Preeya.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I think governments in the Caribbean want to have take care of their persons and have social expenditure. The issue is innovative financing, and how do we procure innovative financing going forward. And we in the Caribbean are not unfamiliar with innovative financing. We have a history of being exposed to natural disaster shocks, hurricanes in particular. And I'd like to give the example of Barbados, where they do have public budgeting that takes into account natural disaster effects every year, so that they are able to accommodate any natural disaster shock. We also have the CRIF in the Caribbean. Let's not forget, it's the first non-parametric insurance to be set up in the world. Initially, when the CRIF would have been set up, it would have been a government type arrangement where funding would have gone to governments.
Just to stop you one second, could you just explain what CRIF is for our audience?
So it's a insurance policy across the Caribbean for Caribbean countries being impacted by natural disasters, where governments put money into a fund, and if a certain threshold of devastation occurs, the CRIF would distribute monies towards these governments for cleanup and reconstruction, etc. When a disaster strikes, because we know that foreign aid can't possibly come after a disaster, but we need immediate access to finance. We need liquid cash as soon as a disaster strikes, and the access to CRIF insurance allows for that. And that is something we should be very proud of in the Caribbean, that we have set up here first in the world. And the point I was getting to in the end is that the CRIF has also moved to the micro level, where they now have a policy tailored to fishermen. So if fishermen would suffer any type of loss, they can actually access insurance through the CRIF. So in making my general point, innovative financing is important so that we can provide these types of social safety nets for our people in the Caribbean. And it is not something new to us.
So basic parametric insurance related to weather events, hazards. So the Catastrophic Risk Insurance Fund, CRIF, is one of these very important innovations. Of course, there are debates over, the costliness of the programs and the accessibility, the terms of accessibility. But it is still, as you said, Preeya, strategic, important, innovative actions on finance that we've been taking in the Caribbean. We have some more.
Just if I could
I have two questions.
If I could just slip this in. When I was talking about the IMF, I wanted to go on to say that in their dealings with Jamaica, they recognized that they had to have minimum thresholds as the economy deteriorated in a few years for the social welfare program. I don't remember what it's called now. It's the PATH. Right. So I'm saying even the fund has come around to agreeing that there was a minimum threshold that was required. So it's not an impossible task.
Thank you. So thank you all for those very rich contributions. And now we have a question from Dr. Jonathan Lashley. His comments to start off with is great, insightful presentations. Recommendations and indications of what is currently being implemented are similar to what has been recommended, especially from our SALISES research in regards to green, blue, and the orange economy, the emphasis on youth, business development for several years or decades. But, and this is an important point, no action has been taken. Is our problem not fiscal deficits, but implementation deficits? Why have we waited until a global pandemic and the start of a major war to take action to speak to diversifying our economies? His closing comment or question is, are our political systems to blame? So basically he's questioning whether or not we have fiscal deficits or implementation deficits, and whether or not the political frameworks in which decision-making is taking place, which takes us back to Dr. Alleyne's point, perhaps are to take some of the responsibility for the non-performance in the region. So that seems another very general question that I could throw out to everyone.
Chair, if I can bat first on this one.
Okay. So
I think it's a bit broader, because I think for the most part our political system and political culture mirrors the society. And so I think the starting point must be in terms of ensuring that we have populations that are in the know and who understands and recognizes the value of good policy, and understands that a good policy has implications for me and my family and others. And consequently too, a bad policy has consequences, negative consequences for me. So the issue is, we need to be able to see a sort of cultural shift and mind changing within the population, so that we are able to have going forward, right? The electorate demanding certain actions in order to deal with our economic development issues, our social development issues. I want to leave it there, but I think that is, to me, where we should start.
Yeah. Any short comments to this? I realize that the time is getting away from us.
Yes, I just want to say that we must abuse ourselves with this notion of having fiscal deficits. Countries will always have deficits. I mean, the issue is whether it's sustainable. Even a debt is not a problem. If it's not sustainable, it's a problem. So that's not in itself a problem. You must, as developing countries with the needs I've set out, they have to borrow. The problem is how you borrow responsibly so that the rate of return is greater than the cost of borrowing. That is essentially what you have to do. Now, coming back to what to me is a hard question, is it implementation? I think the problem is accountability and transparency. We don't have systems that are accountable, and as I said, each budget exercise tells you what we spend, but it doesn't tell you whether we got value for money. And in some countries that have resources, by the way, they accompany their budget with a PR, which tells you which programs are efficient, which are not. So how you arrive at accountability and transparency is not an easy matter. It has a lot to do with the culture and so on, and the people's consciousness and awareness. But Jamaica has made a lot of strides because the budget documents now are up very early. This was not the case maybe 20 years ago, and there's at least a discussion with some of the data, and we know what the debt burden is, and we could track it over time. And there's a fiscal accountability legislation and so on. So there's progress of a kind. Don't let us knock things over and say nothing is happening. There's progress. There are reversals too.
Thank you so much.
Chair, if I can just add something very quickly. Yes, I want to endorse the point of accountability and transparency. We, civil society, private sector, need to hold our governments to account. I think international frameworks are also helpful. We've signed on to the SDGs, all Caribbean countries, and reporting on our progress on the SDGs. It is one way to account. We've also signed on to the Paris Climate Agreement, and we have to submit our nationally determined contributions every 5 years. And these are systems in place to help governments account. Of course, progress is slow, but we need to keep pushing forward.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to go to our last question for the day. This is from Joel Paris. How can Guyana's newfound wealth of oil and gas contribute to sustainable development in the Caribbean? What strategies are needed to allow this to occur? Especially in the context of the contradictions of, other oil-rich countries such as Nigeria and Trinidad, the resource curse phenomena.
I suppose being Guyanese, I am in the fire. I know Trinidad. It's amazing to me that we don't have closer relationship between Guyana and Trinidad and Tobago. Trinidad and Tobago has been in the hydrocarbon business for a long time. They send consultants to Nigeria and these places. And it's just remarkable that the two prime ministers aren't, I want to say in bed together, but talking to each other. Barbados, I think Mayor Motley has made trips to Guyana, but I think that Guyana's fortune should be the Caribbean's fortune. Guyana, as you know, has a population of 700,000 people, and it's 83,000 square miles, set to grow the fastest in the globe. That is a remarkable, if it is fulfilled, and of course there are reversals as in Venezuela and elsewhere. But I'm saying it's good prospects, and we have to engage, and it's just a reflection of the weakness of CARICOM, where we have not, there should have been a meeting of the minds on Guyana and engage Guyana more fully. It needs vast numbers of individuals because of a huge labor shortage, and even the development plan of Guyana, I understand, is being organized by a Mr. Porter. Why was it not Professor Porter? Why was it not being done by UWI? So, a weak integration systems, and at the end of the day, we shoot ourselves in the foot. I mean, it's a lamentation, but it's a reflection that even when we have good fortune, we squander it.
Very sobering points, given the context of the challenges and the opportunities lying side by side, whether or not we will continue to stumble into the future or will take a sharp handle on the resources and opportunities that have been given to us in order to advance everyone so that no one is left behind. I don't know if you want to
Chair,
say a quick
yes,
comment from Preeya.
yes, yes, Chair.
And Dr. Preeya, then Dr. Williams, and then Clarence last. And those will be our final comments before I thank everyone and turn it over for the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Chair. I endorse what Dr. Alleyne said. Trinidad should be speaking closer to Guyana. We've been in the oil and gas business for over 100 years, and I think Guyana is learning from our lessons. So Guyana has been and is being very smart in terms of its utilization of its energy resources. Guyana is producing what is being called a low carbon growth strategy, although it now has more oil and gas reserves and production than Trinidad and Tobago. The country is maintaining itself as a high forest, low deforestation country. So they are going with a green growth strategy, and they are monetizing their energy resources to do this. And it's a pity that Trinidad didn't do this sooner, although there are steps being taken as we go forward.
Thank you, Preeya. Of course, we know Guyana is a very controversial case study in terms of the contract that was negotiated, as well as negative externalities associated with oil exploration and other mineral extractivism that is taking place in Guyana today with respect to the indigenous peoples and the resources that they hold. So these are very complicated stories, as Dr. Alleyne emphasized. Our strategies and policies must be rooted from the community up, diverse voices, diverse perspectives, in order to be able to speak coherently and clearly to the needs for our future and for sustainable development to be authentic rather than rhetorical. So Dr. Williams, the floor is yours very briefly, and then Dr. Henry. Are you hearing me, Kevin? Richard, we're having a problem with Kevin. I'm not sure he's hearing us.
Okay, move on to Dr. Henry.
Okay, I apologize, Kevin. I have to move on to Dr. Henry.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I would close by, commenting on the last question. I think the opportunities created by Guyana's newfound wealth, really, or the development of that natural resource, could either make the regional integration arrangement worsen the regional integration arrangement or improve it. Intra-regional trade right now, there are two countries that benefit significantly from that: Trinidad, Tobago, and Guyana. The rest of the economies have to receive and export extra regionally to generate the foreign reserves to pay for the deficits that they're making in intra-regional trade within CARICOM. But I think, and that's where I end it, and I think it's in the context of everything here that we've spoken about, there needs to be a robust regional development planning process that includes all the countries within CARICOM, and for us to utilize our resources collectively for our collective advancement. And I think that's the most important thing. Yes. Maybe we can start with this current Guyana wealth.
Yes, I think Dr. Lashley would say we've been saying this for a very long time as well. The regional movement has been a very well-developed movement, and it's still suffering from very deep internal tensions and a lack of coherence. But the inequalities within the regional bloc are also very important to stymie some of the efforts to move forward. And I think without specific attention, not only to inter-country differentiations and inequalities, but also intra-country, between country inequalities, the trust and confidence that you need to pull societies forward and to make economies grow based on the enthusiasm and the investments of the people in their societies and their economies, rather than trying to beat the system in the informal sector or to be pulled away, as in migration. And I think no one really mentioned this during our conversation as to how this stim's fiscal capacity and public financing capabilities has been the deep hemorrhaging of talent, skill resources from migration. And at the same time, coupled with population loss in our small states. So we're really moving towards human capital deficits, not just public sector deficits that we may be challenged by in a particular period of time. And these deeper long-term problems that Dr. Alleyne has emphasized that we focus on requires us to take very serious consideration of the migration dynamics within the region and how it is that we correct for some of those structural inequalities that drive that migration process, even though it does come back in terms of remittances and keeps us afloat, even in the worst case scenarios like COVID for Jamaica, or remittances increase, for example, not across the region, but it is perhaps very important for us to realize that migration is a double-edged sword in terms of our capacities to sustain development. So with that, perhaps I took the chair's prerogative for the final word. Dr. Williams, I think we have lost him. I apologize. He wanted to get a word in, and if he's not with us, I'm afraid that we will have to close without his final comment. Richard, is that okay?
Yeah.
Oh, there we are. Go ahead, Kevin.
Okay. For me, it's all about economic growth. It's all about economic growth. It's simple and straightforward. You just need to organize your policy place.
Sorry. So that was the last word for Kevin.
You need to organize your policy
right.
framework.
I think it's
rules in place.
This is an important point.
The right rules in place. Jamaica is talking about fiscal rules. I know some of my colleagues are not too hopeful about these fiscal rules because they are easily broken. Well, in Jamaica's case, they are going to sort of enshrine it in laws so that there is no easy way out of these rules.
Yes.
So it's all about economic growth. You grow the economy, then eventually, everyone will benefit in some shape or form. So that's my parting shot. You need to grow the economy. You grow the economy, the debt to GDP ratio will come down. You'll have more fiscal flexibility to spend on security, education, healthcare, and so on. And you have some savings, so that you can respond to exogenous shocks like hurricane and so on. So it's all about growth.
I think the context in which the point, your emphasis on growth needs to be brought to bear is that as a development economist, when we speak about growth, we're not just talking about output increases, we're talking about qualitative transformations in our systems, which would allow for higher productivity, higher levels of capability development, higher innovation. And therefore, what we get is quality growth rather than growth that is simply a number on an index that says that this number has increased. So the emphasis on growth is important, but is in the context of a development agenda that speaks to the transformational changes required for all boats to rise, for all individuals to benefit, so that the growth is not driven by external beneficiaries to the lack of our domestic capacities to enhance our own skill sets, to enhance our own growth portfolios, that would support long-term sustainable development. So growth is always contextualized. And I think that is the most important point as a development economist that we can leave on the table as to why growth matters, but how in terms of our characteristics as small island developing countries that must ensure social equity, environmental resilience, as well as long-term development capabilities that leave no one behind. So thank you all for riveting discussion, very strong viewpoints, and very clear agenda as to what needs to be done. Obviously, we cannot grow, we cannot develop without having resources, and that is part of the story of growth. So we need to be able to understand the structural long-term dynamics, understand the short-term constraints, and then take very clear strategies for a medium-term framework for engaging in program and policy delivery that is evaluated by communities and reviewed, and participatory processes of budgeting and development delivery actually endorsed and becomes one of the leading characteristics of small island development rather than simply our vulnerabilities. So thank you all for presenting today, and thank to UATV for hosting us, and thanks to all the technical support. And for a more robust thank you, I'd now turn over the floor to Mr. Nelson Stokes, who is one of our, who has recently successfully completed his PhD Viva, and he will soon be Dr. Nelson Stokes. And he will take us in our closing remarks and vote of thanks. So thank you everyone, and thank Professor Lee for leading the initiative, and for Dr. Williams for organizing these events to make it possible.
Thank you very much, Dr. Northover. It's been a pleasure to be here in such an august group of development economists. Allow me to begin by saying thank you to Dr. Henry, not only for your interjections in the discussion point of view, but for pointing out something that I think has been underlined here, which is, you showed that graph with the flat capital expenditure, increase in current expenditure, although it was in relation to the Eastern Caribbean states. But that graph, together with the low growth and the challenges for fiscal responsibility, are not unrelated. So we thank you for that, for bringing that all together. I did look at your 80% debt to GDP with some envy as a Jamaican, but we will get there. So thank you very much, sir. Dr. Kevin Williams, you gave us a very good overview of Jamaica's budget situation, of how the 912 billion is to be spent. I think it was very useful that you highlighted for us not only the headwinds, but how we could respond to those to improve things, and the criticism that we speak a lot and very few things happen. I can be a witness to in my lifetime. For example, the one thing that you mentioned, the agriculture, we've been talking about this a long time, Dr. Williams. I think it's important. And I'm very optimistic about our move with digitization. I know that, for example, in Trinidad, there's a ministry that is dedicated to that. So thank you for that. Dr. Alleyne, actually, I was beginning to mix you up with words on a page. I've read pretty much most of what you have written. Thank you, sir, for a very content-rich presentation, and also your contribution to the discussion. A couple of things stood out for me, sir, as the fact that education was disrupted. That would be a missed opportunity to simply seek to go back into the classroom, and I think Dr. Henry spoke about that as well. Also, the COVID-19, if you think about it as a shock and being prepared for a shock, the fact that we have such high levels of non-communicable diseases just makes us ripe and exposes us at the same time that we are protecting ourselves through investment in education and through building up reserves. We can also, as a society, build up our overall health. It's interesting also, and I thank you for highlighting this, that all the growth projections that we have seen, 79% at the top end, Trinidad is a little lower, may even be flat. still does not get us back to 2019, so we have some work ahead of us. And a point that I am glad is recorded, and I thank you for it, is our approach, particularly in Jamaica, to addressing inflation and raising interest rates in an environment where the shocks that cause an increase in inflation rates may well be beyond our influence, at least in terms of monetary policy. And I think that's a very important point, and I thank you for that, sir. Dr. Preeya Mohan, you used a word many times that I think is very important, which is uncertainties, and we certainly feel that way. You know, we study in economics about shocks, but to have these back-to-back massive global shocks I fear that it may become more common. When I was growing up, we heard about the 1952 hurricane. In the last 15 years, we'll probably have one major hurricane every other year, and we may be moving into that realm. So uncertainty for sure. Your emphasis on the green and the blue economy, which echoed the comments of other presenters, I think was very well. Thank you very much for that. And I also thank you for bringing to light the idea which Dr. Alleyne touched on in terms of the methodology for doing your budget. You touched a bit on it with the practice in Trinidad to link public finance to overall development economic strategy. If we can combine that with a bottom-up approach to dealing with annual budgets and the national development strategy, I think we're onto something, and I want to encourage you to go down that line. Dr. Northover, you have been with me from my first day as a doctoral student until now. I had no doubt that you would excel in moderating this event, and I thank you for that, and you certainly have done that. You framed the issues very well at the beginning, summarized at the end of each presentation very well, and have made your own very valuable contributions. Professor Henry Lee, I hope when I come back to SALISES, it will be to say hello. Well, it will be to say hello, not to seek to register for any courses. I thank you for being here. I thank you for your question. Want to thank the Faculty of Social Sciences in general, SALISES, of course, in both campuses. I want to thank the participants, persons who attended. I saw going on 30 at one point. And of course, those who asked questions that added to the richness of this evening's proceedings. The absolute thank you to the technical staff, you know, especially when you have these things want to go wrong. And to UETV, I have already shared the link with a number of ministers of finance, and I'm glad that it will be online. I have to figure out where, so that we can all benefit from the simple, outstanding presentations, content-rich presentations, thoughtful presentations that we have seen today. So all, thank you very much for taking time to spend with us this evening, to the presenters for taking time to prepare so well, delivering so well, and I wish you all a very good evening. Thank you.